I was asked to speak about options for assessment in online learning. The things I'm going to be talking about today are based on personal experience, but also I don't do many things without making sure that they're kind of kosher with some type of learning theory or instructional design best practice or something like that. So there are some resources at the end of the slides that are things that have kind of informed my presentation today. So first, who am I? Tom gave me that nice introduction. I have a PhD from the Instructional Design and Technology program at Virginia Tech. As Tom said, go Hokies. I'm currently a professor of instructional technology at Georgia Southern University. I've been doing that. I just completed my 13th academic year here. And before that, I was a math instructor at Virginia Tech and one other smaller place in West Virginia. I actually have this 13th year at Georgia Southern, finished 30 years as a full-time higher ed faculty member. So I have some experience in face-to-face, kind of a computer-based hybrid, and then fully online, of course. What I do for my job at Georgia Southern is I design, teach, and research online classes, among other things. I'm an instructional technology professor, so we kind of do lots of things involving ed tech. I taught my first online course, unbelievably to me, in 1999. For those of you that have been around that long, in terms of online learning, you remember the days when you had to worry a lot about plugins and campus infrastructure didn't quite support online learners as well as they do now. So instructors were sometimes the first line of technical support as well as course support. And then, of course, I've been teaching fully online at Georgia Southern since 2009. I go out and do face-to-face things with school teachers sometimes, and sometimes I do faculty development on campus, but all my teaching has been fully online since 2009. And basically, I've been in front of Zoom for the last 2+ years, as many of you have been. So, so this slide was just basically to tell you, I've been around a long time. I have some decent experience. Hopefully I know what I'm talking about. I am certainly welcome to hear critiques and new ideas along the way. What's the purpose of this presentation? It's to provide alternatives to what I would call traditional assessment methods for online learning that are informed by experience and research. I won't address really in any detail grading or marking assignments today, assessments. I'll probably make a few passing comments. Be nice if I had an extra apostrophe there, wouldn't it? These slides will be available later. If you would like to have them, you can just ask Tom or I. Okay. So what's our agenda? Okay, I'm going to give you a slide that kind of gives some of my opinions and biases so you can kind of situate where I'm coming from with those involving online assessment. Then I wrote a paper with a colleague, Michael Barber, I don't know, maybe a year ago, in response to emergency remote teaching course for the pandemic, about 6 common types of assessments. And in that paper, we talk about how you can, what should be done with those during emergency remote teaching, what changes. But for that paper, we collected kind of 6 common types of assessments that are used online and on ground. And I'm going to finish with a brief talk about generative learning strategies. There's a very clever couple of folks who've written on this, and it really kind of impacts how I think about teaching online and the types of assessments that I make and things like that. So we'll go through that briefly. So that's the agenda. Of course, there'll be time for questions at the end, I hope. That's the plan, and we can stop short so there is time for questions if Tom will keep us on track. So 6 common types of assessments online. These are very general: written assignments, online discussion, field work, that one might be a surprise, test, quiz, exam, presentation, and Eportfolio. I use all of these in my practice, actually, to one extent or another, as I'm sure you all do. And the next slides are going to talk about those with a little bit more detail. Oh, I skipped the personal opinions. Let's back up a slide, okay? Personal opinions. With online assessment, quote, the traditional classroom environment is kind of out the window. Especially during the pandemic, we had a lot of people kind of forced into this online delivery, and they really tried to jam that traditional classroom experience into the computer somehow. I have never been a proponent of weekly, 3 times a week talking head lectures. Unfortunately, that's kind of what this is, although we will have hopefully some time for discussion. I'm not a big fan of, the timed quizzes and those kind of things. I just think in an online environment, people start to worry about cheating and academic integrity. And then they go down the route of, oh, maybe we'll use a proctoring service. And maybe some of you do that. I find those to be expensive, stress-inducing issues for students. So I prefer to kind of remove barriers like time quizzes and tests, and I'll talk more about that in the upcoming slides. I really lean towards more authentic assessments, but I know that's not always possible. And I believe that some of my approaches and my opinions on things like time quizzes and tests and using authentic assessments will help address some academic integrity issues. You can never really be completely secure in terms of, quote, cheating. You can raise bars and things like that. And that's what I kind of try to do, is just raise a bar on an assessment to make it harder to cheat or more trouble than it's worth. I can't say that everything's foolproof, but I'll kind of filter that in as we go. Yeah. So again, we've got these 6 common types of assessments in online learning. And we'll just start with the first one, the written assignment. Okay? This is, an old standard. People have been writing papers, writing essays, doing all of these things forever. And when you're talking about online assessment, you're always talking about asynchronous versus synchronous classes. I teach fully asynchronously. Part of that is sort of a mandate from a program that I'm in. And part of it is just, I like the flexibility that affords students and myself, selfishly, but feel that works pretty well. A written assignment could be an essay, it could be a blog post, it could be a discussion post. And I really find that if you're doing that asynchronously, you can have more time for students to have reflection, do critical thinking. You can ask them to read more, reflect more, and put some pieces together and actually have time to compose something that is solid and grammatically correct and those sort of things. If you're doing some type of written assignment synchronously, I tend to focus on less complex assignments, less complex concepts, and use those more for brainstorming, planning assignments, where you're not going to be expecting people to have fully thought out arguments. You're just kind of sharing things a little bit more freely. And my bar is higher on asynchronous written assignments in terms of the quality of the writing and all of those things, the quality of the thinking actually, and a little bit lower if we're doing things on the fly, where maybe you send some students into breakout groups, depending on what you want them to come back with. But there's still going to be, written assignments. In our online learning world, the typed word, typed letters is probably still, even though we have great video capabilities, probably still the most used format. And I'm happy if somebody has like just a burning question they can't wait on. I'm happy to address those as we go. Okay, so written assignment, this like I said, it's the old standard thing and certainly can be used in online learning. It's maybe not the most exciting, but it's still possible. Online discussion. Okay. This probably, in the world of online learning, when you transition from some face-to-face class into an online modality, probably online discussion is right up there at the top of one of the most used assignments, type of assessment. And this is something probably the last, I would say, 3 or 4 years, I have thought long and hard about in my courses. I do use online discussions regularly, although I'm going to talk about what that means in a minute. Initially, I don't know, 13 years ago, 14 years ago, I was probably on the post once, reply twice bandwagon to try to get students to do things. But over the years, my own personal experience was that really wasn't providing a rich discussion. The replies, were short. Of course, you can add some restrictions. You can say you have to have a 50-word reply. That, raises that bar a little bit, makes more work for you, doesn't necessarily excite the students. So what I started doing with my online discussions, one of the first things I did was, instead of having a discussion every week or every 2 weeks in, say, a 15-week semester, I decided students were getting just bored of these. And it was always, okay, I've got to come up with a post. How many words is that? Okay, now I've got to reply twice. There's that. So I decided to stop that frequency of one every 1 or 2 weeks, and just decide in a 15-week course, maybe there is a monthly discussion, maybe a discussion every 3 or 4 weeks. And I typically design those so that my students have a week to read the prompt, do the necessary background reading, compose some type of a statement, and post that. And then they have a week to discuss and do their responses and replies and discussion. I felt like jamming all that into a week-long period. What I ended up with was a bunch of posts 30 minutes before the deadline, and then a bunch of quick attaboy kind of responses 10 minutes before the deadline. Of course, I went through phases, kind of had this evolution where at first, when they were a week, it was, okay, well, you better post by Wednesday, and then you better reply by Sunday. But that was compressed. My students are mostly all adult learners. In fact, they're usually in-service school teachers. So I felt like I was getting a better quality discussion out of them if I stretched it out, say, over that 2-week period. I also recently started thinking about, well, let's not just make these things text-based. And, there's 120 people now on the participant list, so this probably isn't rocket science to everybody. But yes, the discussion board is inherently text-based, but we have a lot of cool tools. We have a lot of capabilities for digital media. So I often will use discussions in a way to kind of force students to be a little bit more engaged with the reading. For example, if I have this 2-week discussion period where the first week is background reading and composing their post. Well, their post might be a concept map about the readings that they just did. So they have a week to do the reading, create a concept map that they post in the discussion board. And if they're mildly tech savvy, they might be able to post that, embed it in the discussion so students can see it. Otherwise, they can attach it or provide a link if they use some online service. Then the discussion, I help facilitate the discussion the next week with learners by telling them, you don't just reply and say, oh, that's a great map. I give them ideas on how to do that. What's missing from your map? Compare maps. What's common? Are there things that some people missed in the readings? Are there connections that you didn't see? And I provide them with that structure to look at something that's not necessarily just a black and white 250-word post, but they had to create one, the students had to create one. Now, I do use LMS features. I teach now in the Brightspace Desire to Learn, but I've taught in Blackboard and different things. And there's typically this feature in a discussion board where you can block students from seeing the rest of the discussion until they post themselves. And that's typically what I do. That raises the bar just a tad. Of course, somebody could do some type of kind of a throwaway post and look at other people's stuff, but it doesn't seem like students do that. But it forces them to kind of get their act together, get their artifacts together before they join the discussion, then go on. I also use LMS features to help me with my facilitation, because I can usually quickly pull up some statistics and see if there's someone who is not replying much, someone who hasn't posted yet, and I can kind of push them a little bit kind of outside the discussion group. You know, I can say, sorry, Tom, you haven't, I see you didn't make your post. Please get it in. After the fact, I can maybe give some people kind of a little debrief and say, well, Tom, you posted, but you really didn't interact with anybody. Let's do better next time. And I find that usually for me, those personal interactions work. Just for some context, you know, my classes are, teach kind of a 3-3 load, typically with about 20 to 25 students. So I'm not teaching enormous sections where you have to keep up with 300 students a semester. Interestingly, how many discussions to use in a course, or the size of a group if you were to split students into groups for discussion. I've done a fair bit of reading about this, and the research just really isn't there to describe what's best. So to me, it kind of comes down to, in those things, a personal preference. If I had a larger class, if I want students to work in kind of a smaller group, I might group them. And then again, I mentioned that my personal experience was maybe in the course of a semester have 4 or 5 meaningful, longer discussions than to have a lot of shorter ones. I use the discussion tool a lot in my class, but we don't necessarily use those as traditional discussions. And some of the ideas that follow in this presentation are some of the things we use in our discussions to talk about in the discussions. Field work. This is one of those 6 types. And you may be asking yourself, wait a minute, we're talking about online learning. Why are we talking about field work? I'll give you just a little bit of context. I teach mostly students who are getting master's degrees in instructional technology. They're either going to be an instructional technologist for a school district, or they're going to be a school library media specialist. And in those types of programs, it's required that the students have field experiences. Now, we sprinkle some in our classes along the way where they maybe talk to someone, interview someone here or there. But at the end, they have a big practicum experience where they actually, it's almost kind of like a student teaching experience, except not quite that intense. The course, my course, is an online course. And it's mostly used to group the students together who are doing this field work and give them some type of a community so that they have a support system, including myself, to ask questions about the various fieldwork assignments, to talk about their specific placements, and maybe ask some questions and some help on how to do things. But during the phases of emergency remote teaching during the pandemic, a lot of that had to just change because you couldn't go out into the schools, and people have changed and have gone more virtual. Teacher education, nursing programs, for example, may be able to use simulations in a fully online course, and that simulations would kind of replace the field work in that sense. They may still want to go on. Of course, optimally, these people would be working with real folks and doing a real field experience, but you can, in an online experience, you can work with simulations if possible, or you can simply use the online course as a community to help support those who are out doing the field work. I lumped test, quiz, and exam all together, and I'm thinking here about mostly, fill in the blank, multiple choice quizzes that back when I did my undergrad work were the main staple of assessment for students. Again, I mentioned before that I had these biases against proctoring. Once you've moved into the online environment, I think my personal belief is you need to let go of certain things that you're holding on to from that face-to-face experience. One of them is the thought of proctoring. Okay? It's expensive, it's stressful, it's not necessarily that effective, so just give it up. Okay? I don't necessarily mean you have to give up tests, quizzes, and exams, though. I do think you should look at your purpose. Why are you doing these? And one thing that I like to encourage and that I do in my own classes is focus on low stakes or no stakes tests, quizzes, and exams. There's actually some decent research that came out in the last year or two on the use of frequent low stakes quizzing. Make it a small portion of the grade, give people multiple attempts, and you've kind of lowered the stress and you've lowered the reason to cheat necessarily because it's not that big of a portion of grade. How do I use these? I have an undergraduate class. And if you're talking about Bloom's taxonomy, for instance, and you're just looking at these lower level skills, maybe where you're learning the vocabulary. If you're entering a field or taking an introductory survey course, one of the things that students have to do is learn the vocabulary of the field or the profession. How do you get them to do that? This goes back to what's your purpose? Well, I want my students to learn those terms and know what they mean. So I'm going to give them frequent low stakes quizzes, multiple attempts, because I'm hoping they'll just continue to do it. Whether they look it up in the book or they look it up online, they eventually get to the point where they're learning that vocabulary. They're learning what those terms mean. I'm not going to necessarily give them a 100-point midterm exam that's worth a lot of their grade in a situation where I know they can just cheat or look it up. But if I give these frequent low stakes quizzes where maybe weekly they've got some terms they need to learn and look up, and I let them take the quizzes multiple times, I think I'm meeting my purpose of making sure that they find those definitions and that they practice them through these quizzes. The no stakes issue is self-assessment, and that's great. You might give at the beginning of a module, you might give students a short, automatically graded self-assessment. If you are someone who wants to go with the test, kind of the traditional exam, again, I say, don't worry about the proctoring. If you're going to give a high stakes test, focus on critical thinking, problem solving, application, and make it as personal as you can. Make it current. If you're asking students to respond to some case study, don't use the same one you used last year. You can probably get to the same goals and objectives if you pull something new for them to use as a case study to do some type of critical thinking and analysis. You might be able to use data from, current news items, current science experiments, and not necessarily repeat things from the last time. So that's my spiel on test quizzes and exams. It's really nice, the LMS tools that we have, you can really do the self-assessments quite easily. You can do these low stakes quizzes pretty nicely. It does take some effort if you're going to do frequent low stakes quizzes to kind of develop this pool of questions. But I would rather spend my time kind of developing and refining a set of questions to use on them rather than trying to defeat the students in some type of cheating issue. Because the students are going to work just as hard as you to try to cheat, and I think the frequent low stakes quizzes take care of it. There's a little bit of research around that says if it's low stakes and happens often enough, the students will just not worry about the cheating so much. Presentation. This is another format that I make a lot of use of, and I combine it back with my discussions that we just talked about. So I teach asynchronously, and that's kind of the frame of mind I'm thinking about. But students can create a presentation and then show it during a synchronous class. There are many free tools available for this. Students can create, narrated PowerPoints or beyond. I mean, you can do video. There are many options, kind of depending on the creativity level of the students for what they want to create as a presentation. The narrated slideshows with various elements, and some of the other things coming later in the slideshow can be incorporated. So students could make a concept map and they could talk about the concept map. They could go out and do some field work. They could do an interview, and then they could talk about the interview and post those in a discussion board. This is one of my favorite things to do, is have students make some type of a presentation based on an authentic activity. They post them in the discussion, and then they use those artifacts to do the discussion as they move forward. So it might be something easy like, I teach educational technology, so they might be reviewing an ed tech tool. They create a short YouTube movie that's a screen recording of their review of a tool. Everybody posts those. I can monitor those like on the front end to make sure not everybody does the same one. Then my students get a nice repository of all of these tools and reviews, and then the next week we discuss them and kind of compare and contrast and talk about things. It works really well to have students do presentations. I do various kinds of presentation activities. Eportfolio. Eportfolio to me is one of those things that had a lot of hype. Then it kind of leveled off. People still use them. They use them in various ways. There are actually a couple of professional organizations on Eportfolio, in a journal or two about Eportfolio. I know they're used more heavily in some professions than others. If you have an Eportfolio, it can simply be an organized repository for students to stick their assignments. In fact, in my program for a master's degree, that's a lot of what our Eportfolio is. They've gone through the program for 2 years, typically. They've had various experiences. They've created different artifacts in their coursework, and they assemble those in an Eportfolio at the end of the program to show us and show themselves what they've done. We add to it this reflective piece where they have to reflect on the artifacts. And Eportfolio can be used to show growth. This is what I was doing, and now this is what I can do. We use it more like, this is what I can do, and with reflections about maybe their growth over time, rather than showing the pre and post artifacts. This is something I've learned kind of the hard way, is students usually need to be taught how to reflect. I've noticed this at my own institution sometimes when discussing things with other people, that we somehow naturally think we should be able to ask students to have an experience and then reflect on it. But you don't get a lot of really deep, meaningful, critical reflection if you just ask students to reflect. So usually, in my classes, if it's the first time in the course that they're being asked to reflect on something, I have a short module just about reflective writing and reflective thinking that they need to complete before they do their first reflection. Then later in the course, I just refer back to that. But if you are doing discussions, if you're doing e-portfolios, if you're doing things and you're kind of dissatisfied, which is where I had arrived a few years ago, it was, man, these students just can't reflect. But then I realized we're teaching them all kinds of cool stuff, but we don't teach them how to reflect. And that's when I kind of incorporated that module on reflection. In terms of ePortfolio, if you're asking students to create them, you need to think about who the audience is and the aim or purpose. A lot of LMS tools now will have an ePortfolio area or some type. But the problem with those usually is at the end of a semester, those are locked up tight, not available to people outside of the course or the institution, and they might go away. We aim a little bit for a more authentic purpose. we have our students create an ePortfolio outside the LMS in a tool of their choosing that we approve. We don't ask them to buy anything. There's lots of free tools that they can use. And we really, our hope is that these would be things, you know, that they would be showing potential employers. Look, I'm able to use my instructional design skills to make this module. I'm able to use my data tools to make decisions about data for my school, things like that. Kind of a more authentic purpose where it's something that they would be showing to a potential employer. But it could be, you know, just for the class, just for the program. Just kind of depends on your purpose, but it is kind of something you need to think about before you start using them. All right, so that finishes, ePortfolio finishes kind of those 6 common types of assessments and my thoughts about them and how they're used. The next kind of phase of this presentation is to talk briefly, we should have a good time to open up for some discussions, is this concept of generative learning. And where I've seen it the most, I mean, generative learning is, if you read learning theories and you like that kind of stuff like I do, kind of ed psyche stuff, it was originated by somebody named Whitrock. But Fiorella and Mayer here took generative learning, and there's a link at the end of the slide to their paper, and really went through the research literature. They found these 8 generative learning strategies, and they go through, they talk about what each of these are. They talk about the kind of what does the research say about these. Some of them have strong research support already. Some of them have emerging research support, but they recommend, you know, these 8 activities as good learning strategies for students. And once I found this paper, I believe it's a 2015 paper. Once I found this paper and started looking at these, it really changed the way I think about online assessment and how I teach online. Because, you know, you can pick up any book, you go search Amazon for tips and tricks for teaching online, and everybody has their opinions, everybody has their methods. But what I really like about this is Fiorella and Mayer are educational psychologists. Of course, Mayer is, you know, multimodal learning theory. He's huge in the field, but and they went through these, and they actually provide the research backing to say these are quality things that you should be doing or that you can do. So I use these a lot with my online discussions. So, you know, they got learning by. So learning by summarizing, and they talk about the learning effects of having someone read something or watch something and go back through and summarize it. So in this case, you know, that's something I'll have my students do. We may all have a chapter in a book that we're going to read, and I will have students make a summary and post it to a discussion forum. And I feel good about doing that, because then we talk about the summaries, everybody's supposed to read everybody else's, and then we talk about things that we may have missed or commonalities that we see, surprising things that we've seen. I think that really helps. Learning by mapping, and here we're talking about the traditional concept map, not some type of geography assignment, but actually doing concept maps. I really like this one because we're already doing things in my classes where students are doing the traditional, you know, typing responses. This gives them a chance to, you know, break away from that. It's a little bit more creative. They can draw a map. I give them pointers to some online tools, but the point of the exercise is to not show everybody's technical skills. So I just tell my students, draw it out on a piece of paper, snap a picture. You know, most people have a phone laying around nowadays. Snap a picture, throw that in your discussion. You know, just make sure that we can read it. Students really seem to have embraced that. I have a lot of students who do writing and drawing by hand for these concept maps. They take a decent picture, they post it up, works really well. Learning by drawing, this works really well if you're talking about things, I don't know, could be a variety of things. The legal system, the structure of government, the water cycle, where you actually ask students to draw what these processes look like. And again, we're not talking about, you know, assessing them on their artistic skill, but are they getting the right pieces in the right order with the right relationships drawn between them? And Fiorella and Mayer, you know, present evidence that this actually helps students learn better. Imagining is one of the ones that's a little bit further out there for some people, you know, for me, maybe, but it's, you know, a little bit more like visualization. Imagine you were doing this, what would you need? You know, what would you have done? Those sort of things where students are, you know, almost brainstorming through activities, or maybe trying to get a process down. You know, imagine you're changing a tire, what would you do? And they're able to, you know, almost go back to the summarizing or the mapping to help them. Self-testing, there's a lot of good research about how self-testing, coming up with your own questions, drilling yourself works to help you learn things. Self-explaining and learning by teaching. I think probably many of us in this presentation today have been in a situation where you thought you understood something, and then you've had to explain it to someone else, and it seemed so much clearer. I know that's been the case for me in several things, and Fiorella and Mayer actually present evidence that that works. And I have my students now in my graduate level classes often put them in small groups, split them up, and ask them to teach a chapter of a book by creating a presentation. So that goes back to one of the other things that I had them do today. And their presentation may involve some summarizing, it may involve a concept mapping activity, but they create this presentation and it's kind of all bundled together to teach their classmates as we work through some reading or some different readings or a book. And then finally, learning by enacting. One of my weaknesses in terms of a teacher, instructional designer, is working with younger learners. So, you know, I'm working with adults. Even my youngest students are still adults. They're going to be undergraduate students. But I often have students in my classes who are teachers of children in younger grades. And this is one that has helped me think about things that they can do, which is learning by enacting. You may remember manipulatives, math manipulatives. So if you could have students, again, do something where they're manipulating objects, maybe they take a picture, maybe they take a video with a phone and they share it back. If it's a synchronous class, you can just have them do it in front of their camera. For younger learners, you can have them enact things by taking different sequences of a story and, you know, getting them in the right order and placing things and actually working with manipulatives. Thankfully, technology today gives us the ability to do a lot of photographs and videos with relative ease, especially compared to what we would have had, you know, several years ago.
Excuse me, Dr. Hodges.
Yes.
Yeah, Alan and a few other colleagues asked regarding learning by drawing. How do you address any accessibility issues of student drawings shared in discussion forums?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. I personally, the things that I do in my classes, I very much try to maintain accessibility. But, you know, obviously there's a problem if students do this. I try to intervene, and this one intervenes maybe not the best, but I try to kind of supplement the classes by providing some text summary of some of the drawings to allow that to happen. But that is an excellent issue, and I haven't, since I started doing this, I haven't had a student who reported, I know that that's a big distinction, who reported an accessibility accommodation for me, but that would very much make me think hard about how to do some of those assignments. But I know there are students who very well may need those accommodations who haven't asked. So I try to kind of supplement some of the drawings with text descriptions in the discussion boards. Yeah, that's a great question and comment. Okay, that ends the presentation. I've got this slide of resources. There's the titles. You can easily find these things. This is my article that I wrote with a colleague, Michael Barber, that I took a lot of this presentation from, Assessing Learning During Emergency Remote Education. That's Hodges and Barber, and it's an open access article. Then there's an excellent book through Athabasca University Press. You can buy a copy if you want, or you can, read it online for free. Assessment Strategies for Online Learning. It's a great book. And then the article that I was mentioning with the generative learning, that one is, a paywall journal article, but if you can probably find it online, or if you're associated with the university, you can usually get a copy. So those are the resources that I had. If you ask for the slideshow, then these are links and they take you off to those things, so you would have them. And that's it. I'm done and ready for questions and discussion. If you want to follow me on Twitter, there I am.